I preached my first sermon in January 1988 in a little church in a coastal town of northern New South Wales to a congregation full of surfers and hippies. I can still picture it and remember it well. But now, over 30 years later, I don't think I've ever introduced a sermon or a series of talks like this one. You see, I'm now fighting life-threatening cancer in my jaw for the second time. I was first diagnosed in mid-2019 with squamous cell carcinoma and had around 19 hours of surgery shortly thereafter. I'm a little camera shy these days, but this is me a week before I underwent the surgery. This second bout of cancer is another tumour, near the previous one, but more serious. For this second tumour, I've just completed 6 weeks of radiotherapy to try and stop it. It has already taken its toll on my body, particularly my face and mouth. And those of you who know me well can probably detect it in my voice, as I may sound a little different. But whether successful or not, all of this may mean my life may be considerably shortened. And for the first time in my life, I'm having to face head-on the real possibility of an early death. And I can tell you, it's been a really sobering experience. It forces you to take a deep and long assessment of your philosophy of life and death, and what might happen to you on the other side, so to speak. What might happen when you die. And that's, I'm afraid, something we all have to face at some stage in our lives. I'm not trying to be morbid and depressing, but it's something every one of us will go through at some stage. And therefore we all have to think about what life might be like, if at all, after death. I came across a gravestone once that said, "Passerby, stop and think. I'm in eternity. You are on the brink." The fact is, all of us are on the brink of eternity, and we all need to, at some point in our lives, think about what might happen once we die. Now, as a committed Christian, I of course believe that when I die, I'll go and be with God in a place we may call heaven. But as any well-versed Christian should know, that label can often be a very unhelpful word. That is because most of us still subliminally get our understanding of heaven and the afterlife not from the Bible, but from the ceilings and windows of our beloved cathedrals and churches. For centuries, the Renaissance and Baroque artists of Europe replaced the clergy who were supposed to teach us the Bible. And it was men like Michelangelo or Correggio, Raphael, who ended up becoming our theological lecturers and seminary professors. Through no fault of their own, it was their art that taught the masses that heaven was an essentially ethereal place of clouds and harps and halos, where humans and angels frolicked together, wearing long white linen robes, or nothing at all, and floated around all day doing very little, it seems. Art like theirs that instilled in our minds, still to this day, that the afterlife was just a spiritual place and not a physical one. But can I say that while they were great artists, they weren't great theologians. The original script of the Bible paints a very different picture. Yes, the Bible teaches us that when the believer dies, they go to be with God in a place we may call heaven. But the Bible also teaches us in numerous places, very clearly, that God will eventually bring this world to a climactic end and totally restore it, reboot it, refashion it, recreate, reconstruct it. And all those with God will be resurrected physically, bodily, to live in it and enjoy it with Him forever. In other words, the Bible tells us that life beyond the grave is with God in a physical world, with us having physical bodies. That's what the Bible says. Now, I know that for most people these days, including members of my own family, that all sounds just simply like wishful thinking. Just pie in the sky when you die. It's something you tell a child when they lose a grandparent or a family pet. But no serious thinking adult should take these things seriously. But that's what Jesus and the apostles openly taught. And it's all there in the New Testament for anyone to see and read. The 15th chapter of Paul's letter to the Corinthians is one of those places. It's a chapter totally devoted to the afterlife and what our bodies might look like and how it all works. And thankfully it's a chapter for the skeptic, the doubter, the questioner. You see, the Corinthians were just like you and me. They had their doubts, their questions, their suspicions of what Paul was teaching. They weren't intellectual pushovers. They didn't want to blindly accept the teachings of Christianity without logically and philosophically thinking it through. They were, after all, the close neighbours of the Athenians, and Athens was, historically at least, the intellectual and philosophical hub of ancient Greece. It was the home of Plato and Socrates and many other famous philosophers and thinkers and mathematicians, graced its lecture halls over the centuries. The Apostle Paul had come to Athens and Corinth 3 years prior to writing this letter, and he taught them the Christian message, the gospel, that is, the story and significance of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. But some of them still had their reservations and questions, understandably, particularly about the resurrection of believers. Questions like, okay, Paul, if we will be resurrected physically one day, what will our bodies actually look like? How will it work biologically? How will we survive for eternity if none of us can live beyond 120 years in this life? Won't our bodies be subject to decay again, just like in this life? And how can we know that what you're telling us will really happen? What confidence do we have that this is fact, not fiction? And do you have any proof of what you're saying is true? And so, chapter 15 of this long letter to the Corinthians is Paul's response to their concerns and questions about resurrection. It's 58 verses long, but I want to invite you to join me as we look at just the first 11 verses together. These verses are so important because they're not only foundational to the rest of the chapter, but they're the entire basis for the reason a cancer sufferer like me can face death head on, and why I have such confident hope.
Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you have received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise you have believed in vain. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. For I am the least of the apostles, and do not even deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them, yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. Whether then it is I or they, this is what we preach, and this is what you believed.
So before Paul gets to their questions and concerns about the resurrection of believers in general, Paul, in these 11 verses, takes every one of us back to the facts of Jesus' own resurrection. This is where it all began for the disciples, especially for Paul. And so Paul begins the chapter with the very foundational story of Jesus' own resurrection, hoping it would give them a platform of confidence in their own resurrection. You see, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then the whole Christian faith dominoes to completely fall over. But if he did rise from the dead, then that ought to change everything. It ought to give us great confidence in everything Jesus said and did, and give us the integrity to the hope we have in our own resurrection one day. For this resurrection was like a movie preview, the first example, the prototype, or as Paul says, the first fruits of the great harvest to come. So Paul gives us a number of great reasons to have confidence in the resurrection of Jesus. Let's look at them one by one. The first thing to note here is that the resurrection was a core teaching of Christians from the very beginning. You may have heard the argument that seems to be growing in popularity these days, that the divinity and resurrection of Jesus came much later on in the teachings of Christianity, but it was never there right from the beginning, right from the start. It was only bolted on, added on further down the track, a century or two later, and therefore we're not to believe it because it's not part of the original core teaching of Christianity. Those who love a good conspiracy theory often perpetuate this idea, that the original true story of Jesus was that he was just a simple, gallant Jewish rabbi from the rough end of Galilee who taught about love and peace and challenged the austerity and the religious shortcomings of the Roman and Jewish establishments of his day. He was arrested and tried for being a pot stirrer and finally died a noble death on a cross. And according to this theory, his tomb and body are still to be found somewhere in or around Jerusalem. And conspiracy theorists love to go on to say that Christianity was then originally about the teachings of Jesus and not so much about the man himself. But after his death, the first disciples began to say to one another, metaphorically, "Oh, Jesus has risen within us," or "He is alive among us." And only further down through the ages, a century or two later, either for good or spurious reasons, Christian took such phrases literally and began to say that Jesus actually rose physically from the dead, not metaphorically. Now, I'd have to admit that if I had found out that our earliest Christian documents didn't mention the physical resurrection of Jesus, or didn't say anything about his divinity, but that these claims about him rising bodily from the tomb and him being alive among the disciples was only found on the pen of Christians who lived a century or two later, then I would find it really hard to believe and take the resurrection of Jesus seriously. However, that is simply not the case. The overwhelming consensus among historians is that Jesus died in AD 30, and the Apostle Paul wrote this letter, these words before us, in the early 50s of the first century, most probably around AD 51 to 54. What I'm telling you is that despite what you might read on some dodgy blog or website, is that the best historians place these words about Jesus' resurrection within a mere 20 to 25 years from the events themselves. In fact, all of Paul's letters mention or allude to the resurrection of Jesus, and all of them were written before the mid-60s of the first century. They are, in fact, the earliest sources we have on Jesus. They all predate the first 4 Gospels that come a short time later. That means then, from the best historical textual evidence we have at our fingertips, we know that the first generations of Christians believed in a bodily resurrection of Jesus. These verses from this letter tell us that Christians were affirming that Jesus rose physically from the dead within the first 20 to 30 years or so. But actually, the text goes further than that. Look at not only what Paul is saying here, but the way he says it. Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you were saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. But particularly look at verse 3. This ought to warrant your attention. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. So in the first two verses, Paul is recalling how he passed on the news of the resurrection to the Corinthians when he came to Corinth 3 years earlier. But verse 3, he goes back even earlier to when he himself received the news earlier than them. So the question you've got to ask yourself is, when did Paul receive the gospel, the good news about Jesus' death and resurrection, before he could pass it on to others like the Corinthians? Well, the fifth book of the New Testament tells us. The book of Acts. The book of Acts is 28 chapters on the first 30 years of Christianity. It is a goldmine for historians, and it's a wonderful chronological clothesline that we can hang just about all the letters of the New Testament onto in some form or another. It's from the book of Acts that we know the answer to our question. When did Paul receive the gospel? When did he find out about the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus? Well, Paul received the good news about Jesus' resurrection 2 decades earlier than when he wrote this letter. Verse 3 is thus Paul winding the clock back to when he was converted while travelling north on the road from Jerusalem to Damascus, on the Damascus road. It was then Paul dramatically saw the resurrected Jesus for himself and received the message from him directly. But this word received here must certainly also include all the times he received the understanding of the gospel from the apostles and sat under their teaching and preaching for a number of years thereafter, and learnt all there was to know about Jesus' life, parables, teachings, death, and other resurrection appearances that he made to many more people. But furthermore, many scholars believe that a section of these words didn't actually originate with Paul in this letter, but that Paul has inserted or adapted, borrowed a very early Christian creed. Creed is a summary statement of belief. Here, it was used by the first Christians to outline the core truths of their faith. In the world of biblical scholarship, there's a science called source criticism that I find rather fascinating, but I'll probably put most of you to sleep. It's made up of men and women who are kind of like literary detectives who look for clues and signs on how a manuscript, be it a letter or a book or an essay or something like this, might have come together, how it was all pieced together, how it was composed. And many of these source critics now agree that Paul has inserted a well-known Christian creed that was circulating among the very earliest Christians, probably in Jerusalem. And it begins halfway through verse 3 and may end as far as verse 7. The creed may have been used at a baptism for a new convert to say before being baptized, or for a group of Christians to say before they started a service or halfway through their service in their gatherings in Christian homes or whatever. However it was used, it seems that the creed dates to the first decade of Christendom. And one way we can detect the date of something like this is the use of the name Cephas in the Creed in verse 5. Cephas was the Apostle Peter's Aramaic name. Aramaic was the spoken language of Jesus and the first Christians in Palestine. And the fact that the early form of Peter's name here is preserved in the text not only points to this being a very early Christian creed, but again helps us to date it to the 30s of the first century. The point of all of this is to show you that the first Christians proclaimed Jesus as risen from the dead, that he rose bodily from the grave. It wasn't an additional appendix to the story bolted on centuries later by misguided or fanciful Christians. The best historians don't say that. It was there attested from the very beginning. The next thing to note is that the resurrection had many witnesses. Jesus didn't appear to just a few people on one misty night after they'd been to the pub. He appeared to many different people in multiple locations, up close and in broad daylight, over the period of a month. Luke tells us that at the start of the book of Acts. Here, Paul tells us that Jesus appeared first to the original apostles, with Peter being singled out as having his own separate encounter with Jesus. We know from the Gospels that Thomas saw Jesus on a different occasion to the others, the other apostles that is, when Jesus invited him to touch his wounds. We're also told in the Gospel of John that on several occasions Jesus ate with the disciples in different locations after he was resurrected. And here, Paul is saying that at least on one occasion, Jesus not only appeared to all the disciples several times over, but Jesus showed himself to as many as 500 other people, with Paul adding, at the same time. Now, if that's true, what possible alternative explanation could account for that? That has to rule out any form of hallucination, or dream, or even conspiracy that the early Christians had for the resurrection. Furthermore, Paul also includes this little bit of information. He says, of those 500 people, most of them are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Now, fallen asleep was a euphemism for death for the Christian. So some of those witnesses had died, but many of them were still alive. That not only helps us again date this to a very early period in Christendom, but Paul is practically saying to the Corinthians, skeptic and believer alike, many of those 500 are still alive today, and you're welcome to go and interview them and ask them exactly what they saw. Then on top of the original apostles and the 500, Paul adds more to the list. James and the other apostles. James here was Jesus' half-brother, born to Joseph and Mary after Jesus was born. He's singled out here not for being the sibling of Jesus so much, but that he went on to become the leader of the church in the city of Jerusalem. Now just think about that for a moment. How hard it would be to get one of your own siblings to believe that you are God incarnate, the Christ, and worship you as the Son of God. Look, you may be able to, as some have done over the years, to convince a few people, like some cult leaders have done in the last century or so. But to convince someone of your own family that you are divine, sinless, that is very impressive indeed. James, more than anyone on that list, would have known Jesus intimately. He would have seen him as a child, a teenager, doing chores around the house, responding to his parents' orders, doing life, going to synagogue and so on. No one could have been closer to him, witnessed his behaviour and known him better. Yet he was a close relative, a blood brother, who shared the same mother, someone who lived under the same roof, who is listed as among the first witnesses and believers. I've often thought about that and find that very compelling. Then Paul finally adds himself into the list, calling himself as one abnormally born. That is because, as he says, he persecuted the church. Unlike the rest in the list, Paul was not a follower of Jesus. He wasn't one of the disciples. He wasn't one of the apostles. He was originally a skeptic and an enemy of Jesus. He was a Pharisee, a sect of ultra-strict Jews in Jesus' day who were bitterly and strongly opposed to Jesus, having claims to being the Messiah, and the message of the first Christians, which they deemed as blasphemy. Pharisees, by the way, were the chief instigators to have Jesus arrested, tried, and crucified. Paul, as a Pharisee, took up the cause after Jesus was crucified and became a head campaigner in having the Christians of Judea rounded up, imprisoned, and even executed. Paul, in fact, oversaw the stoning of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. Stephen was stoned just outside the city walls near the Garden of Gethsemane. Yet a resurrected Jesus appeared to Paul on the road to Damascus, and he was radically changed and converted to Christianity. There were many witnesses to Jesus being alive again, including those who were his enemies. Thirdly, the resurrection believers were surprisingly Jewish. Now, in all my years of reading and preaching, I don't think I've come across this argument before, but I think it's a pretty powerful one. Maybe some of you have thought about this or come across it before. I don't know. But the fact that the first converts were deeply convicted Jews, especially Paul, is very, very striking, especially if you are familiar with Middle Eastern culture. If you've ever spent considerable time in the Middle East, or you know someone well who is either committed Jew or Muslim, then you may appreciate this point, because you'll know just how deeply ingrained, entrenched and committed they can be to their faith and traditions. Most Orthodox Jews are fiercely devoted and dedicated to their beliefs, their ancestry, their customs. If you're a committed Jew, your religion is at the forefront of your work, your education, your schooling, your ethics, your social gatherings, your family heritage, your diet, your dress code, and so on. Therefore, committed Jews don't switch religions easily. It's extremely rare for committed Jews to change faiths. For a Jew to become a Christian isn't like switching sports codes. It's not like going from hockey to baseball, or switching teams like going from Manchester United to Chelsea. It's considered far worse, far more surprising, far more rarer than that. It's considered traitorous, disloyal and shameful. It's blasphemous. And many Jews were threatened with segregation and being ostracized from their families and their communities if they switched beliefs. Jesus and the apostles radically reinterpreted the law and the Ten Commandments, the temple, the sacrifices, the priesthood, and most significantly of all, the Messiah, who he was and what he came to do. So, to become a Christian was a drastic departure from what they'd been taught for centuries, and it was costly. In other words, a Jewish fisherman like Peter, or a Jewish carpenter's son like James, or a Jewish scholar like Paul would have had a whole heap of additional reasons not to believe in the resurrection. Not just biological concerns like you and I might have about a dead man walking, but also theological ones, traditional ones. Yet despite all that, and the tremendous cost that they would have had to endure from their families, from their communities, they still believed and still proclaimed that Jesus rose from the dead. Fourthly, the resurrection believers were martyred for their faith. It's a point made many times, but I can't resist not to mention it. Many of the early Christians, including most of those in this list, were persecuted and or martyred for their faith. They went to their deaths saying that Jesus rose from the grave, and they didn't recant or deny it under torture. Admittedly, the sources are a little hazy, but our best accounts put Peter, or Cephas, as mentioned here, in Rome when he died, and he was crucified upside down for his faith. Several accounts tell us that James, the Lord's brother mentioned here, was thrown from a high point of the wall of the temple in Jerusalem, and then possibly stoned thereafter. And the Apostle Paul was famously beheaded in Rome himself for his faith. All three of those men did not recant, did not back down from saying they had seen and beheld and hung out with Jesus who rose from the dead. It's just very compelling to know that many of the first eyewitnesses went to the grave unwavering to their claim that Jesus rose physically from the dead. And now finally we come to our fifth and final point. The resurrection was part of a much bigger plan. The resurrection was intricately connected to a much bigger story that goes way, way beyond mere coincidence. The idea is behind the word Christ, and twice used in the phrase, according to the scriptures. You see, it's worth pointing out that Paul could have easily used the name Jesus here, but he intentionally didn't. He deliberately kept the title Christ, reminding us of who Jesus is and all of what he had accomplished. As most of you know, Christ wasn't Jesus' surname. He wasn't the son of Joseph and Mary Christ. Christ was a title that was not thrown around easily. In Greek, it is Christos and is a translation of the Old Testament Hebrew word Messiah, which means the anointed one of God, the King of God's choosing, the one whom God has commissioned and endowed with his Spirit to be his representative here on earth. In Jewish thought, it was way above any human office such as Pharaoh or president or king or emperor. It was the highest office in the world, and importantly confirmed by supernatural events and abilities, not just one or two, but many. Jesus was already widely known as Christ the Messiah because he had already healed hundreds of people. He'd walked on water, calmed a storm, fed the 5,000, turned water into wine, taught with such vigour and authority, claimed he was divinely connected to the Father, and even raised others from the dead. The point is, Jesus was no one-trick pony. His own resurrection was just one of many miraculous things he did. So by reminding us that the person who was resurrected was already widely recognised as the Christ, gave much more credence, much more weight, authority to the claim that he rose from the dead. I'd be a lot more suspicious and reluctant to believe in the resurrection if it was the only miraculous thing Jesus did. But Jesus did many more miracles. He was much more than a one-trick pony. But also, the fact that Jesus' death and resurrection was in accordance with the scriptures means that this was part of a much bigger plan, revealed in the Old Testament, written centuries before Jesus lived, died, and rose again. It has been calculated that Jesus directly fulfilled over 300 Old Testament specific prophecies. And in other ways, in his life, death, and resurrection, it's foreshadowed and prefigured in numerous stories of the Old Testament. From the stories of Eden to Noah, from the story of Joseph in Egypt to the stories of Moses and Joshua, from King David to the imprisoned Daniel, from the story of Jonah to the prophecies of Isaiah and many more. There are simply hundreds of stunning parallels and links to be made with Jesus' own life, death and resurrection. It becomes abundantly clear that the resurrection was part of a huge plan of God that can be traced all the way back to the early chapters of Genesis. And when you see it, when it's shown to you for the first time, it blows your mind. And therefore, the resurrection of Jesus and the resurrection of my own body one day seems to me to make a lot more sense and be a lot more feasible as I see it within the great tapestry of God's big story in the whole Bible. It's a jigsaw piece that fits beautifully within the huge picture of God's unfolding plan for humanity. Let me conclude by saying this. As I face the possibility of an early death, I'm beginning to think even more seriously about where I might go when I die. I'm beginning to think afresh what I believe in and why I believe it. And I'm so glad I was taught from an early age in my faith that questions and doubts were not to be frowned upon or swept under the carpet, but were, if handled correctly, actually encouraged, because they were great ways of boosting one's faith, not negating it. I think it's very healthy for all of us, whether we're an atheist, an agnostic from another religion, or a Christian, to stop and think and ask ourselves about what we believe in and why we believe it, particularly when it comes to death and life beyond the grave. And as I've tried to show, I believe the resurrection of Jesus has great traction, great credibility. And I really do hope this makes you think about your own destiny as I contemplate mine.